Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of people who watch these videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy this kind of content, I'd really appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps the channel more than you think. Please leave a like. Share your thoughts in the comments and let me know where you're watching from. Your interaction helps these stories reach more people. Thank you for being here. My name is Frank Tillman. I served as a law enforcement officer in Crosby County, Texas for 32 years. Most of that time I worked nights. Small county, wide territory, long stretches of nothing between towns. You learn early that out here, silence isn't peaceful. It's just what happens when there's no one left to hear anything. I'm retired now. I live outside Lach in a house that creaks when the temperature drops and settles when the sun comes up. I still wake up around 11 every night. Not because I need to, because my body remembers when the radio used to come alive. I don't believe in ghosts. Never have. I don't believe in curses or folklore or restless spirits tied to old land. I believe in procedures. I believe in radio logs, timestamps, and the kind of patterns you only notice after you've answered the same call enough times to stop asking why. This is one of those calls. It began on a Thursday night in February of 2019. That part matters. In this county, Thursdays are quiet. No high school games, no weekend traffic, no church events running late. If the phone rings on a Thursday after 11, it's usually mechanical trouble, livestock on the road, or someone who waited too long to call for help. That night the temperature dropped below 20. Freezing rain earlier in the evening had glazed the roads, and dispatch had already logged 3 minor accidents before I heard my call sign. I was driving south on Highway 207, just past the county line, keeping it under 40 because black ice doesn't care how long you've worn a badge. The radio cracked once, then steadied. Unit 1. That was Denise, night dispatcher. 15 years behind that desk. If she was rattled, you heard it immediately. She wasn't rattled. She said there was a caller on County Road 184, no address. Elderly male. Reported someone trying to break into his back door. County Road 184 runs east to west through some of the most isolated farmland in the county. A dozen houses over 8 miles. Most of them set back far enough from the road that you won't see them unless you're looking. No address bothered me. The hang-up bothered me more. I acknowledged the call and turned around. On the drive out, I ran through the same checklist I'd run 100 times before. Possible burglary. Possible misidentification. Wind, wildlife, someone hearing their own house settle and deciding it's a person instead of weather. You don't dismiss fear, but you don't let it write the report either. When I turned onto the gravel, my headlights caught ice on the ruts. I slowed to a crawl and started checking properties in order. First house was dark, seasonal residence, logged mentally and moved on. Second house had lights on, television visible through the front window. Family sitting on a couch, no signs of distress. Third property was empty. I knew the mailbox name. Henderson's, Winters in Arizona. 6 miles down, I saw light through the trees. One room lit at the back of an old farmhouse, set off the road by about 200 yards. Cottonwood in the yard, outbuilding behind it that might have been a barn once. I called it in and pulled into the driveway. That was when Denise came back with a name. Raymond Cobb. Lives alone. No prior history. I approached on foot. Front door first. Announced myself. No response. Television was on inside. Laughter track. Old sitcom cadence. I knocked again. Louder. Still nothing. I circled the house, checking windows, scanning for movement. When I reached the back door, I saw him through the glass. He was sitting at the kitchen table. Back to me. Hands on the table. Not moving. I knocked on the glass and called his name. Nothing. That's when Denise came over the radio again and told me the caller was back on the line. Same voice, same fear. Said someone was at his back door. I was standing at that door. From there, procedure took over. Welfare check, forced entry, EMS notification. Every step followed policy. Raymond Cobb had been dead for hours. Heart attack, most likely. No signs of struggle. No signs of intrusion. Locked doors, windows intact. And yet the calls kept coming. The first thing you learn in this job is that radios don't lie, but people misunderstand what they're hearing. The second thing you learn is that when the logs don't match reality, you document anyway, and let someone else decide what it means. Except that night, the logs matched perfectly. The landline in that kitchen rang 3 times after Raymond Cobb's heart stopped. The third time, the caller described me standing in his kitchen. After midnight, when the temperature dropped and the house should have been silent, the phone kept breathing. I didn't put that in the report. Not because I was told not to, because there was no box for it. The problem with writing reports is that paper expects events to end. Raymond Cobb's didn't. After EMS confirmed time of death and the coroner finished his initial assessment, the house shifted from a potential crime scene to a quiet administrative problem. Notify next of kin if any could be found. Log the call as resolved. Except nothing about it felt resolved. When I got back to the station around 3 in the morning, Denise was still at the dispatch desk. She had both call logs pulled up on her screen. She didn't look at me when I walked in. She just slid the printout across the counter. 14 calls. That was the number. 14 separate 911 calls originating from Raymond Cobb's landline over the previous 6 months. Every one logged as unfounded. Every one occurring after midnight. Every one reporting the same thing. Someone at the back door. Different deputies had responded. Different shifts, different nights. Same outcome, no sign of intrusion. Mr. Cobb apologizing, saying he must have imagined it. I asked Denise why I hadn't been briefed. She didn't answer right away. She just scrolled. Because nothing ever escalated, she finally said. He always called back. Always said it was fine. Policy says we don't flag repeat welfare calls unless there's a progression. That was true. Mostly. There are unwritten rules in law enforcement. Things that don't go in the handbook but get passed down anyway. One of them is this. When an address generates repeated calls with no visible cause, you don't draw attention unless it forces itself into your paperwork. Raymond Cobb's never had. Until it did. I went home just before sunrise. Carol was asleep. I didn't wake her. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that went cold in my hands and tried to reconstruct the timeline in my head. Raymond Cobb died sometime around 4 in the afternoon. He was sitting at his kitchen table when it happened. The autopsy would later confirm that. He didn't fall, didn't reach for the phone, just stopped. The first call came in just before midnight. 8 hours later. That meant one of 2 things. Either the phone system was malfunctioning in a way that perfectly reproduced his voice and timing, or the calls weren't coming from where the system said they were. Neither explanation fit inside a report. Over the next week, I reviewed every prior response to County Road 184. I spoke to deputies who had answered those earlier calls. Most barely remembered them. One stood out. Deputy Karen Walsh had responded 3 times. She remembered everything. She told me Raymond Cobb had always been waiting, always sitting in his kitchen when she arrived. Not panicked, not angry, just relieved. But the thing she couldn't explain was what happened when she left. Every time, she said, she looked back at the house as she pulled away. And every time he was standing in the kitchen window, not waving, not moving, just watching. At the time, she'd written it off as paranoia. Old folks do that. They want to make sure you really go. Except Raymond Cobb hadn't been standing. He'd been sitting. For hours. That was the first red flag that didn't fit the pattern. The second came 3 weeks later. I was off duty when Denise called my personal phone. She never did that unless policy demanded it. There was another call from County Road 184. Same description. Same voice. The house was still empty. Estate unresolved. Back door boarded. Utilities disconnected except the landline, which hadn't yet been formally shut off. I drove out anyway. This time, I didn't announce myself. I parked in the driveway with my headlights off and sat there listening to the wind in the cottonwood branches. The house looked inert. Dead. Just wood and nails and a history that should have ended. The radio crackled. The caller said there was a patrol car in his driveway. I hadn't keyed my mic. I approached the house slowly. Flashlight down. Denise relayed what the caller was saying in real time. Where I was standing. what direction I was facing. When I reached the back door, I put my ear against the plywood. I heard breathing. Slow, steady, human. That was when the rulebook failed. There's no protocol for a dead man narrating your movements from inside a sealed house. I cleared the call as unfounded. That was my decision, my signature, my responsibility. I didn't write about the breathing. I didn't write about the voice. I wrote what policy allowed. No evidence of intrusion, property secured, no occupant present. After that, the calls didn't stop. They spaced themselves out. Once every few weeks. Always Thursdays. Always after midnight. Always the same. And always someone responded. Because that's another unwritten rule. You answer the call even when you know it's already too late. The problem with unfounded calls is that they don't disappear. They accumulate. After my second return to County Road 184, I started tracking the responses more closely. Not officially. Not through any system anyone else could see. I kept a notebook in the bottom drawer of my desk. No case number on the cover. Just dates, times, unit numbers. The calls came roughly every 3 to 4 weeks. Close enough to form a rhythm. Always Thursdays. Always between 11:40 p.m. and 12:15 a.m. Never earlier. Never earlier. That kind of consistency doesn't happen by accident. The deputies who responded after me didn't know what I knew. They weren't briefed. They didn't need to be. As far as the system was concerned, County Road 184 was just another welfare check address with a history of false alarms. I listened to their radio traffic from home. You get used to recognizing voices after 30 years. You can tell how close someone is to the edge just by how tight their acknowledgments sound. Most of the deputies treated it like routine. Drive out, check the doors, log it, clear the call, but a few of them hesitated. One deputy reported hearing something inside the house but couldn't identify it. Another noted that the phone line inside was ringing when he arrived, but stopped when he stepped onto the porch. One mentioned that the kitchen light was on even though the power should have been disconnected. None of that made it into official reports. Because there's another unwritten rule. If something doesn't change your actions, it doesn't go in the log. By the time I officially retired 6 months later, County Road 184 had generated 16 calls. I didn't tell Torres. That wasn't negligence. It was triage. David Torres was young, smart. The kind of sheriff you want in a county like ours. He believed in clean reports and clear causes. If I told him about a house that made phone calls without anyone inside, it wouldn't help him do the job. It would just live in his head. So I said nothing. The first time Torres responded to County Road 184 himself was 8 months after I turned in my badge. I know because I was listening. I keep an old scanner in my garage. Carol never liked it. Said it sounded like trouble. I told her it was habit. The truth is, habits don't wake you up at night. Anticipation does. It was a Thursday, just before midnight. Dispatch gave the call. Same wording. Same cadence. Torres acknowledged and rolled. He cleared it 20 minutes later, unfounded, but his voice didn't sound the same when he signed off. A week later, I ran into him at the hardware store. He asked me, casually, if we'd ever had trouble with false calls out on 184. I told him what policy allows. Some calls don't stop, I said. You just answer them. He nodded, but I could see the question hadn't gone away. That's how it starts. Not with fear, with curiosity. I think about Raymond Cobb more now than I did when he was alive. I think about the way he sat at that table. How still he was. How the phone calls didn't stop when his heart did. I think about the breathing. There's a temptation to explain it. To say grief lingers. To say loneliness leaves an imprint. To dress it up in language that makes it feel manageable. I don't do that. I've been in enough houses to know that places remember routines better than people do. They remember where chairs sat, where hands rested, where someone waited. County Road 184 still waits. The house was sold last year. Young couple. Weekend place. Cheap price. They don't live there full time. Yet. The landline is gone now. Disconnected. At least on paper. But dispatch still gets the calls. They come in without a number attached. Same voice. Same fear. Same time. When that happens, Denise doesn't ask questions. She routes the call like she always has. A unit responds. The house is checked. Nothing is found. Unfounded. Sometimes I hear a deputy pause before clearing. Just long enough to listen. I don't think Raymond Cobb is calling for help anymore. I think he's calling to make sure someone comes. Because when the radio answers, when tires crunch on gravel, when a flashlight cuts through the dark kitchen, the house isn't empty. And for a few minutes, neither is he. I still listen to the scanner most nights. Not because I expect to hear something dramatic. Not because I'm waiting for proof. I listen because patterns announce themselves quietly. They don't knock. They don't escalate. They repeat until you either recognize them or stop paying attention. Most nights, County Road 184 stays silent. Traffic stops. Domestic calls. Livestock on the shoulder. The ordinary friction of a small county trying to sleep. And then, every few weeks, right when the hour tips over, Danae's voice changes just enough that I feel it before I understand it. She doesn't say the address anymore. She just says there's a caller reporting someone at their back door. No location attached. That's another thing the manuals don't prepare you for. Calls that exist without origin. Calls that don't technically violate policy, but don't obey it either. When that happens, a unit still responds. They always do. Because the call exists in the system long enough to require closure. Someone has to drive somewhere. Someone has to put eyes on something. They usually go to County Road 184. The house doesn't look wrong in daylight. That's important. Nothing about it signals danger or decay beyond what time does to any structure left alone. The cottonwood still stands. The barn still leans. The porch boards creak when the temperature changes. It's only at night that the house becomes specific. Deputies have told me that off the record. But the house feels more defined after midnight, like it's waiting for something it recognizes. One of them told me he heard the phone ring inside after the line was disconnected. He didn't write that down. He didn't have to tell me. I heard it in the way his voice flattened when he cleared the call. Another deputy swore he saw movement in the kitchen window after checking the doors. Not a person. Just the sense that someone had shifted their weight. That one transferred counties a month later. I think about Raymond Cobb sitting at that table. How long he'd been there before he died. How long he'd listened to the house breathe. How many nights he waited before calling. There's a moment when you're alone long enough, when the line between noise and presence dissolves, when the house stops being a structure and starts being a witness. Raymond Cobb didn't call because someone was breaking in. He called because something was already there, and it wouldn't let him be alone. I don't know when the calls will stop. I don't know if they ever will. Houses don't age the way people do. They don't move on. They don't forget routines once they've learned them. They remember footsteps. They remember voices. They remember where the phone hung on the wall and how it sounded when someone lifted the receiver with shaking hands. That house remembers being answered. And as long as someone keeps answering, it has no reason to stop calling. Sometimes, late at night, I think about Carol's last words to me. Don't be alone. Don't end up alone. I think about how fear doesn't always want rescue. Sometimes it just wants acknowledgement. A voice on the other end. Proof that the dark heard you. County Road 184 still gets that proof. Somewhere, on some Thursday night yet to come, another deputy will drive out there. They'll check the doors. They'll hear nothing they can explain. They'll log it as unfounded and go home. And somewhere inside that house, whatever learned to call will wait again. Because that's what it does. It waits. There's a point where you stop asking whether something is real and start asking whether it's finished. County Road 184 never felt finished. About a year after the house sold, Denise retired. Quietly. No party. No send-off. She'd given enough of her life to that desk. On her last night, I brought her a cup of coffee just before midnight. We didn't talk about work. We didn't need to. As I was leaving, she said something that hadn't been in any log. She said the calls didn't always sound the same. I stopped in the doorway. Sometimes, she said, the voice wasn't scared. Sometimes it sounded relieved. Like whoever was calling already knew someone was coming. I asked her why. She never mentioned that. She smiled in that tired way. Dispatchers do when they've learned not to invite questions they can't answer. Because it didn't change what we did, she said. And because it didn't feel like my place to decide whether someone should be heard. After Denise left, the calls kept coming. different dispatcher. Same cadence, same phrasing, same pause before the hang-up. Like the caller knew exactly how long they were allowed to stay connected before someone on the other end started asking questions that couldn't be answered. I heard Torres respond to the call again one winter night. He stayed longer that time. Almost 40 minutes. Long enough that I could picture him standing in the kitchen, flashlight off, listening. He didn't clear it as unfounded. He cleared it as checked and secured. That's a subtle difference. One word changed. Enough to acknowledge that something had been there, even if he couldn't say what. A month later, he stopped responding personally. That's another thing you learn in this job. You don't keep going back to places that don't change. You send someone else. You rotate the exposure. The house didn't seem to mind. The calls still came. I sometimes wonder what would happen if no one answered. If dispatch let the phone ring until the line went dead on its own. If a unit didn't roll. If the system logged the call as dropped instead of unfounded. But I don't think that would end it. I think it would make it louder. Because this was never about a break-in. And it was never about help arriving in time. It was about the moment in between. The moment when a voice connects to another voice. When someone on one end of the line knows they aren't speaking into silence. When the house remembers how that felt. Raymond Cobb didn't want saving. He wanted company. I've driven past County Road 184 during the day. The place looks smaller than I remember. Less important. Just another farmhouse waiting to be maintained or neglected depending on who owns it next. But at night, size doesn't matter. At night, what matters is whether someone answers. I don't wear a badge anymore. I don't have a call sign. I don't have authority over anything except my own attention. But sometimes, just before midnight on a Thursday, I turn on the scanner and sit very still. When the call comes in, I don't speak. I just listen. And when I hear the unit acknowledge, when I hear tires on gravel through an open mic, when I hear the pause before the clear, I let myself believe that for a few minutes, Raymond Cobb isn't alone. Maybe that's all any of us get in the end. Not rescue. Not explanations. Just the knowledge that when we reached out into the dark, something answered. All right. This is where it stopped being about the house. And started being about me. I didn't notice the change right away. That's the thing about psychological erosion. It doesn't announce itself. It just alters your sense of proportion until the abnormal feels manageable and the normal feels suspicious. After Denise retired, I stopped trusting the radio the way I used to. Not because it malfunctioned. Because it worked too well. Too consistently. It delivered the same pattern without deviation, like something had learned exactly how much reality it was allowed to occupy without triggering intervention. I started sleeping less. Not insomnia in the dramatic sense. I slept. Just not deeply. Midnight became a boundary instead of a time. I'd wake up a few minutes before it, heart already moving faster, body bracing for a sound that hadn't happened yet. Carol noticed before I did. She asked why I'd started keeping the scanner closer to the bed. Asked why I muted the television at night. Asked why I flinched when the house settled. I told her it was habit. That wasn't a lie. It just wasn't the whole truth. The truth was that I'd begun hearing things when the scanner was off. Not voices, not words, patterns, breathing, if you want a label for it, but not coming from any one place. More like the suggestion of rhythm, the expectation of sound rather than sound itself. I told myself it was memory. 32 years of nights training my nervous system to anticipate radio traffic. Ghost signals left over in the brain. There are studies about that. Occupational conditioning. Phantom alerts. That explanation worked until the night it didn't. It was another Thursday. Of course it was. I didn't check the calendar. I didn't need to. My body already knew. I was in the garage, sitting on an upturned crate with the scanner on the workbench in front of me. The volume was low. Just enough to register activity without forcing me to listen. The scanner crackled. Not dispatch. Open carrier. Dead air. That happens sometimes. Someone keys a mic accidentally. A stuck transmission. Normally it resolves in a second or two. This one didn't. I leaned forward, turned the volume up a notch. That's when I heard it. Breathing. Not over the radio. Not exactly. It was coming from both places at once, from the speaker, from somewhere behind me. Soft, slow, unhurried, like whoever was breathing had all the time in the world. I stood up too fast and knocked the crate over. The sound broke whatever spell my mind had started to accept. The breathing stopped immediately. The scanner went quiet. No dispatch log, no unit acknowledgement, nothing to indicate that anything had happened at all. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I checked myself for signs of stress-induced hallucination. That's what we're trained to do. Rule out internal causes before you externalize. I ate. I showered. I worked in the yard. Everything felt normal. Until just before noon when my phone rang. It was Taurus. He didn't waste time with small talk. He asked me if I'd ever responded to County Road 184 off duty. I told him no. He asked if I'd ever monitored dispatch without being logged. I didn't answer right away. He said something had happened the night before. Something he couldn't reconcile with the logs. A unit had acknowledged a call that never officially existed. The acknowledgement time stamped 3 minutes before dispatch recorded the call. Radio clocks don't drift like that. He said the unit in question swore they'd heard breathing over the air before dispatch spoke. Plural. They both heard it. That was the moment the ground shifted. Not because something supernatural had been confirmed, but because the experience had moved beyond my head. Torres didn't ask me what I thought it was. He asked me how long it had been happening. I told him the truth, longer than anyone wanted to admit. After that, I was asked not to listen anymore. Not formally, no written order, just concern framed as kindness. Torres said he didn't want me carrying something that wasn't mine anymore. Said I'd earned my rest. I nodded. I agreed. I lied. I stopped using the scanner. I didn't stop listening. Because once you've trained your mind to expect a call, silence isn't neutral. It's pressure. The breathing came back a few nights later. Not loud, not frightening. Familiar. Like a reminder. I found myself standing in my kitchen at midnight without remembering walking there. Found my hand resting on the wall near the phone we don't use anymore. That scared me more than anything else had. Not the house, not the calls. The possibility that I was starting to respond. Carol died the following year. Cancer. Fast. Merciless. Hospitals have their own rhythms. Machines that breathe for people when they can't anymore. I sat with her through the nights and learned how sound fills space when you're waiting for something to stop. Her last words to me were simple. Don't be alone. After she was gone, the house felt different. Quieter, but not empty. The breathing didn't come every week anymore. It came when I noticed the absence too clearly. I don't listen to the scanner now. I don't need to. Sometimes, just before midnight, I hear the radio in my head crackle to life. Hear Denise's voice the way it used to sound before she retired. Calm, professional, steady. I hear a call that doesn't list an address. I hear a unit acknowledge. And I understand something I didn't before. County Road 184 isn't a place anymore. It's a function, a routine learned so well it no longer requires a source. Raymond Cobb isn't calling for help. He's calling to confirm the line is still open. And some nights, when the house is too quiet and the walls seem to wait, I wonder how long it will be before the call sounds like it's coming from my own number, because I know now what happens when no one answers. The pattern doesn't stop. It adapts. The first time I heard my own voice on the line, I didn't recognize it. That's important. It wasn't distorted. It wasn't echoing. It wasn't wrong in any obvious way. It sounded exactly the way my voice used to sound on the radio after midnight. Controlled, neutral, tired, but steady. I was sitting at the kitchen table. Carol's chair was still where she'd left it. I hadn't moved it. I told myself it was because the house felt unbalanced without her. The truth was simpler. I didn't want to admit that absence could occupy space. The clock on the wall read 11:58 p.m. I wasn't listening to a scanner. I wasn't holding a phone. I was just sitting there, hands wrapped around a mug I hadn't touched. And then I heard myself say it. Someone's at my back door. It didn't come from the room. It didn't come from my head. It came from everywhere in between. That's when I understood the last unwritten rule. The one nobody ever says out loud because once you do, you can't pretend you don't know it. Long enough exposure turns responders into addresses. I stood up slowly. I checked the doors. locked. Checked the windows. Intact. The back door was exactly where it had always been. Solid, unmoving, unthreatened. I wasn't afraid of someone getting in. I was afraid of someone arriving, because part of me was already waiting. I didn't call anyone. I didn't write anything down. I sat back at the table and forced myself to breathe until the sensation passed. When the clock rolled over to 12:07, the pressure eased. Not relief, release. The next morning, Torres called. He asked me if I'd slept. That was the moment I knew the situation had moved into the aftermath phase, even if no one was using that word yet. He didn't ask about County Road 184. He didn't need to. He told me dispatch had logged another call. No origin, no number, no audio recording attached. Just a notation that the caller's voice matched a known profile. Mine. They hadn't told the deputy that responded. They routed the call as a test, a control measure. He checked the old house. Nothing wrong. No movement, no sound. But when he cleared the call, the timestamp corrected itself. That shouldn't happen. Torres said Internal Affairs wanted to review it. Quietly. He said they were worried about residual exposure, about suggestion, about the way long-term responders internalize patterns after retirement. He asked me to come in for an evaluation. I didn't. Not because I was afraid of failing it, because I already knew the outcome. They would ask if I was hearing voices. I would say no. They would ask if I believed I was in danger. I would say no. They would ask if I felt compelled to respond to non-existent calls. I wouldn't know how to answer that one. A week later, the calls stopped. That's what the logs show. No more entries. No more unfounded welfare checks. No more phantom dispatches routed to County Road 184. The house fell quiet. Too quiet. Torres told me they were closing the internal review. That without new incidents, there was nothing to pursue. He sounded relieved. He should have been. I told him I was glad. I didn't tell him that the calls hadn't stopped. They just changed format. They don't come through systems anymore. They come through memory, through habit, through the space left behind when a life ends without witnesses. Some nights, just before midnight, I find myself standing at my own back door, listening. Not for footsteps. For acknowledgement. I understand Raymond Cobb now, in a way I couldn't when I was wearing a badge. I understand that fear doesn't always want resolution. Sometimes it wants continuity, proof that the loop hasn't broken. The house on County Road 184 taught that lesson well. It taught the system how to answer even when no one was there, and eventually it taught the responders how to call. I don't know how long this lasts. I don't know if it ends when I do. I don't know if the line stays open, or if someone eventually disconnects it from the other side. What I do know is this: if you hear a call after midnight with no address attached, and the voice sounds calm instead of scared, pay attention. That means the house isn't asking for help anymore. It's checking to see who's still listening. And if you answer long enough, one night you'll realize you don't remember picking up the phone. You'll just know that someone is coming. And you'll feel relieved. Because for a few minutes, you won't be alone. I told myself that when the calls finally stopped, that would be the end of it. That once a place stopped generating noise, it stopped needing attention. I was wrong about that. Some places don't make calls. They just wait for someone to listen long enough to notice their breathing. I used to believe that houses were passive. Wood, nails, wiring, the sum of what people put into them and nothing more. Whatever happened inside was temporary. Whatever stayed behind was memory, not presence. County Road 184 should have cured me of that idea. But it didn't. It just made me notice something else. The call came from a place outside my jurisdiction, technically. Merrick Place. Unincorporated land. Just far enough off the county line that responses depended on who was closest, not who officially owned the address. That's how these things slip through. Not because no one's watching, because everyone assumes someone else is. I was still active then. A few years before retirement. Night shift, as usual. The call was logged as a noise complaint. Breathing sounds inside a vacant structure. Those are almost always animals. Raccoons in the walls. Wind through bad siding. HVAC systems cycling when they shouldn't. You respond, you confirm, you clear it. The first deputy on scene did exactly that. Unfounded? The second call came 3 nights later. Same address. Same description. Breathing inside the house. No movement. No visible source. Different deputy. Same outcome. By the third call, the address caught my attention. Not because of the sound, but because of the house itself. Merrick Place had been empty for over a year. Owner deceased. No heirs on record. Utilities shut off. Windows boarded from the inside. That last detail matters. People board houses from the outside. That's how you keep others from getting in. This one had been boarded from within. I took the call myself on the 4th report. Thursday night, just before midnight. That pattern hadn't meant anything to me yet. It would later. The driveway was overgrown, but not abandoned. Grass pressed down like tires had been there recently. No fresh tracks, just evidence of repetition. I announced myself at the front door. No response. The house smelled closed. Stale air, dust, old paper. The kind of smell that tells you a place hasn't been lived in, but hasn't accepted that fact yet. I stood in the living room and listened. At first I heard nothing. Then I realized that wasn't true. There was a rhythm to the silence. A slight pressure, like the air was moving just enough to register without becoming sound. Breathing is the closest word for it, but it wasn't coming from lungs. It was coming from the house. Slow, even, patient. I moved room to room. No animals, no vents active, no mechanical explanation that fit the consistency. When I stood still long enough, the rhythm returned. When I moved, it stopped. That was my first mistake. I treated it like something that reacted to observation. It wasn't. It was reacting to attention. I cleared the call as unfounded. I didn't note the sound. I noted the absence of cause. Same thing officially. The calls didn't stop. They spaced themselves out, like County Road 184 would later. 3 weeks. 4 weeks. Always late. Always calm. Always someone reporting breathing inside an empty house. Sometimes the caller was a neighbor. Sometimes a passing driver. Sometimes no caller at all. Just dispatch receiving ambient audio before the line disconnected. No voice. Just the sound. After the 7th call, I went back alone. That time, I didn't walk through the house. I sat in the living room and listened. The breathing came back after about 2 minutes. Not louder, not faster. Just present. As if the house had confirmed that someone was willing to stay. I remember thinking very clearly that the sound wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from the space where people used to be. That's when I noticed the chair. Dining chair pulled back from the table. Dust undisturbed everywhere else. A faint outline where someone had sat recently enough to leave an impression. No footprints, no fingerprints, just the shape of waiting. I left without clearing the call. I told dispatch the structure needed further review. That bought me time. Time I used to dig. The previous owner had died in that house. Alone. Natural causes. Found days later when a utility worker noticed mail piling up. Nothing unusual. Except for the phone records. Multiple late-night calls in the months before his death. Noise complaints. Someone breathing outside his bedroom door. Someone standing in rooms he wasn't in. Every call cleared. Every response unfounded. The breathing had started before the house was empty. It hadn't left when the owner did. That's when I started to understand something I wish I hadn't. Some places don't become haunted because someone dies there. They become inhabited because someone stayed too long while they were still alive. I didn't tell anyone what I'd found in the phone records. Not because it was classified. Because it didn't change how the calls were handled. Noise complaint. Welfare check. Clear and move on. That's the gravity of procedure. It pulls everything back into the same shape no matter how strange the edges get. But I started paying attention in a different way. I asked dispatch to leave the line open the next time Merrick Place came in. No announcement. No questions. Just listen. The audio came through thin at first. Audio came through thin at first. Then the rhythm settled in. Breathing. Not labored. Not weak. Not panicked. Patient. It sounded closer than a wall. Farther than a body. Like it was occupying the space where sound expects something to be. 2 deputies were en route that night. Separate units. Different radios. Both acknowledged the same sound before either arrived. That was new. They pulled up from opposite directions. I listened as they checked the perimeter. Doors intact. Windows sealed. No signs of entry. When they stepped inside, the breathing stopped. Not faded. Stopped. Both units paused, long enough that dispatch asked for a status check. Neither answered right away. Then one of them said something that didn't make it into the report. He said it felt rude to move. He laughed when he said it. The kind of laugh people use when they don't want to be the only one taking something seriously. They cleared the call as unfounded. 2 weeks later, a utility worker called it in. Same address. Same sound. He was outside the house when he heard it, coming through the boards like someone sleeping in the next room. By the time we arrived, the sound was gone. That's when I stopped going inside. I learned the rule the house was teaching. Movement ended the sound. Stillness invited it. On my next visit, I stayed on the porch, sat on the step, hands on my knees. Radio clipped but silent. I didn't announce myself. I didn't knock. After a minute, the breathing began. It was louder outside. Clearer. Like the house was no longer trying to contain it. I stayed until dispatch asked for a status update. The breathing stopped as soon as I spoke. That was the moment it stopped feeling accidental. The house wasn't generating sound. It was responding. I asked for permission to install recording equipment. Nothing intrusive. Environmental monitoring. The kind of thing you justify as preventative. The recordings came back clean. No breathing. No anomalies. No evidence that anything had happened at all. Except the calls kept coming. And the people who stayed still kept hearing it. The turning point came when a deputy stayed too long. He was new. Hadn't learned the rhythm yet. He went inside, checked the rooms, found nothing, and decided to sit in the living room to finish his report before clearing. 10 minutes later, dispatch called him by name. He didn't answer. I drove out there myself. His unit was still in the driveway. Engine off. Lights dark. I found him sitting on the living room floor, back against the wall. Hands resting open in his lap like he'd been set down there. Breathing filled the room. Not his. The house. He looked at me when I stepped in, eyes unfocused, like he'd been listening to something too close for too long. He told me he hadn't realized how loud it had gotten. He transferred counties the next month. After that, the calls slowed. Not because the house changed. Because we did. Dispatch stopped routing units automatically. They downgraded the calls. Logged them as ambient noise. Let them drop when the line disconnected. The breathing didn't stop. It just stopped being acknowledged. That's the thing about places like Merrick Place. They don't want occupants. They want witnesses. Someone to confirm that what they remember still matters. I drove by once after the house finally collapsed. Roof in, walls buckled, the shape gone. But when I parked and sat still long enough, I could still hear it. Not in the air. In the habit. In the expectation that if I stayed quiet, something would fill the space. I left before it did, because by then, I understood the risk. Not that the house would follow you home. That you'd start carrying it with you. Breathing where silence used to be. Waiting for someone to notice. I didn't tell anyone what I'd found in the phone records. Not because it was classified. Because it didn't change how the calls were handled. Noise complaint. Welfare check. Clear and move on. That's the gravity of procedure. It pulls everything back into the same shape no matter how strange the edges get. But I started paying attention in a different way. I asked dispatch to leave the line open the next time Merrick Place came in. No announcement. No questions. Just listen. The audio came through thin at first. Believing you, Donnie. Audio came through thin at first. Then the rhythm settled in. Breathing. Not labored. Not weak. Not panicked. Patient. It sounded closer than a wall. Farther than a body. Like it was occupying the space where sound expects something to be. 2 deputies were en route that night. Separate units. Different radios. Both acknowledged the same sound before either arrived. That was new. They pulled up from opposite directions. I listened as they checked the perimeter. Doors intact, windows sealed. No signs of entry. When they stepped inside, the breathing stopped. Not faded, stopped. Both units paused, long enough that dispatch asked for a status check. Neither answered right away. Then one of them said something that didn't make it into the report. He said it felt rude to move. He laughed when he said it. The kind of laugh people use when they don't want to be the only one taking something seriously. They cleared the call as unfounded. 2 weeks later, a utility worker called it in. Same address. Same sound. He was outside the house when he heard it, coming through the boards like someone sleeping in the next room. By the time we arrived, the sound was gone. That's when I stopped going inside. I learned the rule the house was teaching. Movement ended the sound. Stillness invited it. On my next visit, I stayed on the porch, sat on the step, hands on my knees. Radio clipped but silent. I didn't announce myself. I didn't knock. After a minute, the breathing began. It was louder outside. Clearer. Like the house was no longer trying to contain it. I stayed until dispatch asked for a status update. The breathing stopped as soon as I spoke. That was the moment it stopped feeling accidental. The house wasn't generating sound. It was responding. I asked for permission to install recording equipment. Nothing intrusive. Environmental monitoring. The kind of thing you justify as preventative. The recordings came back clean. No breathing. No anomalies. No evidence that anything had happened at all. Except the calls kept coming. And the people who stayed still kept hearing it. The turning point came when a deputy stayed too long. He was new, hadn't learned the rhythm yet. He went inside, checked the rooms, found nothing, and decided to sit in the living room to finish his report before clearing. 10 minutes later, dispatch called him by name. He didn't answer. I drove out there myself. His unit was still in the driveway. Engine off. Lights dark. I found him sitting on the living room floor, back against the wall. Hands resting open in his lap like he'd been set down there. Breathing filled the room. Not his. The house. He looked at me when I stepped in, eyes unfocused, like he'd been listening to something too close for too long. He told me he hadn't realized how loud it had gotten. He transferred counties the next month. After that, the calls slowed. Not because the house changed. Because we did. Dispatch stopped routing units automatically. They downgraded the calls, logged them as ambient noise, let them drop when the line disconnected. The breathing didn't stop. It just stopped being acknowledged. That's the thing about places like Merrick Place. They don't want occupants. They want witnesses. Someone to confirm that what they remember still matters. I drove by once after the house finally collapsed. Roof in, walls buckled, the shape gone. But when I parked and sat still long enough, I could still hear it. Not in the air. In the habit. In the expectation that if I stayed quiet, something would fill the space. I left before it did, because by then, I understood the risk. Not that the house would follow you home. That you'd start carrying it with you. Breathing where silence used to be. Waiting for someone to notice. I never went back to Merrick Place after that. Not officially. The structure was condemned within the year. Weather finished what neglect had started. The county signed off. The address stopped appearing on dispatch screens. On paper, the problem resolved itself the way problems are supposed to. But habits don't follow paperwork. For months afterward, I found myself adjusting my pace when I walked through quiet rooms. Slowing down without realizing it, standing still a little longer than necessary, as if waiting for something to resume once I stopped moving. Breathing doesn't have to be loud to be present. That was the lesson Merrick Place left behind. It taught me that sound isn't always produced. Sometimes it's invited. Sometimes it only exists when someone gives it permission by paying attention long enough. County Road 104 made that lesson personal later. But Merrick Place was where I first understood the mechanism. Not haunting. Conditioning. A place teaches you how it wants to be observed, and if you comply often enough, you become part of the routine it's preserving. That house didn't need a living person or a dead one. It just needed someone willing to stay quiet. I've noticed something over the years. Deputies who worked that area still avoid standing still inside empty buildings. They don't talk about it. They don't have to. You can see it in how they keep moving, how they clear rooms faster than necessary, how they step back outside to finish reports. They learned the rule without ever being taught. Stillness is participation. I think that's why the breathing never made it into recordings. Machines don't wait. They don't anticipate. They don't create space for something to fill. People do. And once you learn what fills that space, you don't unlearn it. Merrick Place is gone now. The address doesn't exist. The boards have rotted. The land has been reclaimed by weeds and time. But every so often, when a deputy reports an empty structure that feels occupied without being occupied, I know exactly where that feeling comes from. Not the building, the expectation. Because once a place teaches you how to listen, you don't need the place anymore. You just need the quiet. And if you stay in it long enough, something will always breathe first. Houses aren't the only things that remember. Roads do too. They remember who walked them, who stood on the shoulder too long, who never made it where they were going. And sometimes, when enough time passes without acknowledgement, they start putting people back where they were lost. Highway 60 doesn't feel like a place where people disappear. That's what makes it different. It's a straight stretch of road cutting through open land. No sharp turns, no blind hills, no trees close enough to swallow headlights. You can see for miles in both directions, especially at night when the air settles and the dark feels clean instead of crowded. If someone's standing out there, you're supposed to see them. The first call came in as a stranded pedestrian. That alone was unusual. Highway 60 isn't where people walk. There's nowhere to walk to. No houses close enough to justify it. No businesses open after dark. If you're out there on foot after midnight, it usually means something has already gone wrong. The caller was a trucker, calm, precise. Said there was a man standing between mile markers 112 and 113. Just off the shoulder. Not asking for help. Just standing there, facing traffic. Dispatch logged it as a welfare check. I acknowledged the call and headed out. The man wasn't there when I arrived. That happens. People move. They accept rides. They wander off into places you don't expect. I logged it as unable to locate and continued patrol. 27 minutes later, the call came back in. Same description. Same mile markers, different caller. This one was shaken. Said he'd slowed down. Said the man had looked at him as he passed. Not waved. Not stepped back. Just watched him go by. I turned around. This time I parked on the shoulder and killed my lights. Sat there with the engine ticking and the radio quiet, watching the road stretch out in front of me. That's when I saw him. He wasn't hard to spot. Average height, dark jacket, hands at his sides, standing exactly where the caller said he would be. Not moving. I approached slowly, staying on the asphalt so he could hear me coming. Standard procedure. Don't startle. Announce presence. He didn't react. When I got close enough to speak without raising my voice, I noticed the first thing that didn't fit. He wasn't oriented to the road. He was facing slightly away from it, toward the field. Toward nothing. I asked if he was all right. No response. I asked if he needed assistance. Still nothing. That's when I noticed there were no footprints around him. Not on the shoulder. Not in the gravel. Not in the dirt beyond the asphalt. Just his shoes touching the ground without disturbing it. I reached out and put a hand on his sleeve. My hand went through empty air. Not resistance. Not cold. Absence. The figure didn't vanish. It didn't fade. It simply wasn't there. The radio crackled at the same moment. Dispatch said there was another call coming in. Another driver. Same location. I looked back at the spot where the man had been standing. He was there again, closer to the road this time. That was the moment I understood this wasn't a sighting. It was a position. Something that returned to the same coordinates regardless of who observed it. I didn't try to touch him again. I stood back and watched. Cars passed. Some slowed. Some didn't. Headlights washed over him without changing anything. He didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't acknowledge them at all. He wasn't waiting to be seen. He was waiting to be recognized. I radioed for backup. 2 units responded. When they arrived, the man was gone. When they checked the area, they found nothing. When they turned back to their vehicles, he was standing behind mine. Between the mile markers, exactly where he'd started. No one said anything for a few seconds. Then one of the deputies asked the question everyone was thinking. Is he supposed to be here? That's the wrong question to ask, because some things don't care whether they're supposed to be anywhere. They only care whether someone notices they're not. Backup didn't help the way people expect backup to help. It rarely does with things like this. 3 of us stood there on the shoulder, engines idling, radios open, watching a stretch of road that looked exactly like it always had. Flat. Empty. Harmless. The kind of place you'd never remember if something hadn't gone wrong. I asked each deputy what they'd seen. The answers didn't match. One said the man was closer to the road, almost in the lane. Another said he'd been farther back, near the fence line. The third said he'd seen him standing behind my cruiser. But when he turned his headlights on, there was nothing there. Different positions. Same timestamp. Dispatch confirmed it. All sightings logged within the same 2-minute window. That shouldn't be possible. I asked dispatch to pull prior calls from that stretch of Highway 60. They came back fast. Not a lot. Not enough to stand out at first glance. 1 stranded pedestrian last year. 2 welfare checks the year before that. A hit and run from 5 years back that never went anywhere because there was no vehicle debris and no witnesses. All between mile markers 1 on 12 and 113. All after midnight. All with the same note buried in the comments section. Subject located on shoulder. Unable to make contact. Disappeared prior to approach. Nobody had flagged it. Because none of it was dramatic enough to flag. We don't mark patterns until they hurt someone. That night I told the deputies to clear. I stayed. Not because I was brave. Because I didn't want anyone else trying to interact with something that didn't behave like a person. I parked with my cruiser angled slightly away from the road. Lights off. Just enough distance that I could see both the shoulder and the field beyond it. At 12:41 a.m., the figure returned. Same posture. Same orientation toward the field. Different distance from the road. Closer. I didn't speak. Didn't move. I just watched. The longer I watched, the clearer something became. He wasn't reacting to me. He wasn't reacting to traffic. He wasn't reacting to anything in the present. He was aligned to something else. I checked the mile marker behind him. Then the one ahead. Then I paced it out. 27 yards from the shoulder. Exactly. That number meant nothing to me until I went back to the reports. The hit and run from 5 years back. The victim had been thrown 27 yards from point of impact. Never identified. No ID. No phone. No missing person report that matched. The body had been removed. The location hadn't. I keyed the radio and asked dispatch to pull the coroner's diagram from that case. They did. The overlay matched. The figure wasn't standing randomly. He was standing where something had ended. I stepped forward slowly. Not toward him, but sideways, breaking the line between the road and the field. When I did, he shifted, not away, toward alignment, always correcting back to that same invisible point. That's when I stopped thinking of him as a person, and started thinking of him as a marker. I spoke then. Calm, low. I didn't ask questions. I stated facts. I said the night, the highway, the mile markers, the year of the incident. When I said the date, the figure reacted for the first time. Not movement. Orientation. His head turned just enough that I knew he was listening. I didn't tell him to move. I told him he didn't have to stand there anymore, that the report existed, that the location was logged, that someone knew where it happened. I don't know why I said that. It wasn't training. It wasn't protocol. It was instinct, the kind that comes from too many nights standing between people in the worst moment of their lives. The figure stepped back, not fading, not vanishing, just no longer occupying the point. Then he was gone. The radio stayed silent. No more calls that night. No more calls the next night. Or the next week. I went back during daylight and walked the shoulder. There was nothing there. No sign, no disturbance. Just a small rusted reflector post that had been knocked loose and never replaced. I filed the report carefully. No speculation. No language that would get someone sent for evaluation. Just times, distances, coordinates, and one final note. Recommend permanent marker placement at location. They installed a new mile marker 6 months later. The calls never came back, but I still slow down there, every time, because some things don't leave when they're frightened away. They leave when they're finally placed. I wish I could say that was the last time I learned how thin the line really is between a place and the thing that happened there. But once you start noticing how locations hold on to events, you begin to see it everywhere. Some places mark the moment quietly, like a mile marker that finally makes sense. Others don't stay still at all. The next case taught me that not everything waits by the road to be acknowledged. Some things follow you home. I didn't go looking for this one. That's important to say up front. After Highway 60, I made a point of not chasing patterns. I still did my job. Still answered calls. Still trusted procedure. I just stopped assuming that places behave the way they were supposed to. The building didn't look wrong. That was the problem. It was a single-story county annex about 12 miles outside town. Records, storage, surplus equipment, old interview rooms nobody used anymore. Built in the late 70s. Concrete block, flat roof, no windows on the west side. We used it mostly for overflow. Evidence waiting to be transferred. Boxes of old case files no one had requested in years. The kind of place you forget exists unless something reminds you. The reminder came as a radio malfunction. At least, that's how it was logged. Dispatch called and said Unit 4 had keyed their mic and gone silent. Open line. No voice. No background noise. Just dead air holding the channel. That happens. Faulty shoulder mics. Loose wiring. Someone sits down wrong. Protocol says you try to raise them twice. If you can't, you send another unit to check welfare. I was closest. When I pulled into the lot, Unit 4's cruiser was there, engine off, doors locked. No sign of disturbance, no footprints around the vehicle. The building behind it sat quiet and dark except for one interior light glowing faintly through the front glass. That light shouldn't have been on. I knew the inventory schedule. Nobody was assigned out there that night. I keyed my radio and called for Unit 4. No response. But the channel stayed open. Not static. Not interference. Presence. Like someone holding the line without speaking. I entered the building. The air inside was stale, heavy with paper dust and old metal. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead in sections, some on, some off, like they'd been left mid-pattern. I announced myself. My voice sounded wrong in that space, not echoed, flattened. I followed the sound of the open radio signal. It led me down a short hallway to interview room B. The door was open. Unit 4 was inside. He was seated at the table, hands folded, radio clipped to his shoulder exactly where it should be. Eyes open. Breathing steady, not injured, not restrained. Just sitting. I asked him what happened. He didn't answer. I stepped closer and noticed the first thing that didn't fit. The tape recorder on the table was running. Red light on. Spools turning. But nobody had logged an interview. I reached for the recorder to stop it. Before my fingers touched the button, a voice came through the speaker. Not his. Not mine. It was calm, measured. Familiar in a way I couldn't place at first. It was asking questions. The kinds of questions you ask when you already know the answers. I looked at Unit 4. His eyes were focused on the table, not the recorder. And that's when I realized he wasn't being questioned. He was listening. I didn't shut the recorder off. That wasn't a decision. It was hesitation. The kind you get when you know that touching something will change it, and you don't yet understand what you're standing in front of. The voice on the tape continued. It wasn't loud. It wasn't distorted. It sounded like a deputy conducting a routine follow-up. Calm. Patient. Neutral tone. The kind of voice you trust because it doesn't push. I recognized the cadence before I recognized the words. It was my cadence. Same pacing. Same pauses. Even the way it let silence do the work. I hadn't conducted an interview in that room in over 7 years. I asked Unit 4 again if he was all right. This time, he blinked, just once. Then he shook his head slowly, like he was waking up from something heavy. He asked me what time it was. That question mattered. I told him. He frowned and looked at the wall clock above the door. The clock read 1:12. His watch read 22:47. Dispatch confirmed it was 1:13. He'd lost more than 2 hours. I guided him out of the room and into the hallway. He walked without resistance, without confusion, just quiet. Before we left, I glanced back at the table. The recorder was still running. The tape label was blank, no date, no case number. That shouldn't happen. Every tape gets labeled before it ever spins. I secured the room and took Unit 4 back to his cruiser. EMS checked him and found nothing wrong. Vitals, normal. No signs of trauma. No intoxication. They asked me if he'd been under stress. I said what supervisors always say. We all are. I didn't file the recorder under evidence. I signed it out as surplus review. That was the first line I crossed. Back at my office, I played the tape. It started mid-conversation. The voice, my voice, was asking about a night shift 3 years earlier. A domestic call that never resulted in charges. A woman who'd refused to make a statement. A man who'd said nothing but watched the floor the entire time. I remembered the call. I remembered the address. I remembered deciding not to push. The voice on the tape did push. It asked the questions I hadn't. The ones that would have turned the room cold. The ones you don't ask unless you're ready for what comes next. Then the tape switched voices. The answers weren't coming from Unit 4. They were coming from someone else. Someone who had been in that room years earlier. Someone whose interview had never been recorded because officially, it had never happened. I stopped the tape. Checked the case file. There was no interview logged. No tape submitted. No transcript. But the recorder knew. That room knew. Over the next week, I checked old inventory logs. Interview room B had a history. Not dramatic. Not bloody. Just incomplete. Missing recordings. Interviews conducted off the books. Conversations summarized instead of transcribed. Times when the record said no statement given, but the truth was that someone had talked and no one had wanted to hear it. I went back to the annex after midnight, alone. The light in interview room B was on again. I didn't turn it off. I sat at the table and clipped the recorder to my shoulder the way we all do. I didn't ask questions. I listened. The tape played a different voice this time. Older, tired, confessing to something small that had led to something larger. Something that never made it into a report. Something that had been buried under procedure. When the tape stopped, the room went quiet. The recorder clicked off on its own. I left. The next morning, I sealed interview room B. Labeled it structural issue. The county agreed to decommission the annex 2 months later. They never asked why. Unit 4 transferred shortly after. He doesn't remember that night, but he won't wear a shoulder mic anymore. And I don't conduct interviews without recording. Not ever. Because some rooms don't forget what's said in them. They just wait for someone to listen. The annex was supposed to be sealed. Locks changed. Power cut. Inventory cleared. On paper, the building no longer existed as a functional space. That lasted 12 days. On the 13th, dispatch called and asked why I was logged into the interview system at 2:06 a.m. I told them I wasn't. They read the activity back to me anyway. Voice authentication confirmed. User ID matched. Interview room B. I drove out there without lights. The lot was empty. The building was dark. No interior light this time. The front door was unlocked. Inside, the air felt different than it had before. Not heavy. Not stale. Settled. Interview room B was exactly as I'd left it. Table centered. 2 chairs. Recorder on the surface. A new tape was inside. Labeled. My handwriting. Date and time stamped for a session I had not conducted. I sat down. That was the second line I crossed. The tape began immediately. My voice asked a question I had never asked anyone. Not professionally. Not personally. It asked what happens to the things people say when no one files them. The answer came slowly, not emotional, not angry, matter of fact. It talked about statements minimized, about interviews summarized into nothing, about truths deemed inconvenient because they complicated timelines or careers or elections. It named cases I remembered, cases I had signed off on. The tape wasn't accusing, that was worse, it was documenting. When it stopped, I stayed seated. I didn't feel watched, I felt measured. I removed the tape, placed it in an evidence bag, and logged it properly. That afternoon, I reopened 3 cases. 2 resulted in amended reports. 1 resulted in charges. Nobody asked why I'd changed my mind. People rarely do when the paperwork is clean. Interview room B never activated again. The annex was demolished 6 months later, but I still hear my voice sometimes. Not audibly. Procedurally. In the pause before I decide not to ask something. In the moment where I consider summarizing instead of recording. That room taught me something I wasn't trained for. That silence isn't absence, it's storage. And once you realize that, you understand why some places don't let go. They're waiting for the record to be complete. After the annex was torn down, I told myself I'd learned the lesson. That if you document things properly, they stay where they belong. I was wrong, because some records don't live on paper. Some of them follow the people who tried not to hear them. I thought distance would change things. After the annex, I requested temporary assignment outside the county core. Nothing dramatic, just a quiet rotation assisting a federal land management unit that shared jurisdiction with us along the northern boundary. Mostly routine work, checking access roads, responding to lost hikers, coordinating with search and rescue when someone underestimated how fast daylight disappears out there. The forest didn't feel wrong, that's what I told myself. It was winter, late enough that the leaves were gone and the understory was open. You could see deeper between the trees than you could in summer, which should have made things feel safer. It didn't. The first call came from a volunteer trail monitor. Middle-aged, experienced, not prone to exaggeration. He said he'd heard someone using his call sign, not calling for help, not responding to a check-in, just repeating it, over the radio. Dispatch thought it was interference. So did I. Radio bleed happens in terrain like that. Signals bounce. Old frequencies wake up at night. You hear echoes of things that were never meant to carry that far. Still, protocol says you verify. I drove out to the trailhead he was assigned to. No vehicle. No footprints leading away from the access road. The radio crackled as I stepped out of the cruiser. My call sign. Spoken clearly, in my voice. I didn't respond. I checked the channel log. No outgoing transmission from my unit. The voice repeated the call sign again. Same cadence, same pause at the end like it was waiting for acknowledgement. I switched frequencies. It followed. That's when I felt the distance change. Not physically, operationally. The forest absorbed sound differently than buildings did. There were no walls to store it, no rooms to replay it, but there were paths. I followed the transmission deeper into the tree line, using signal strength instead of sight. The farther I went, the clearer it became. Not louder, closer. I keyed my mic and said nothing. Just clicked it once. The response came immediately. My call sign. Then coordinates, my coordinates. I stopped moving. The forest around me was still. No wind, no animals, no incidental noise. Just radio presence. I realized then that this wasn't someone calling from somewhere else. It was something keeping pace. Not behind me. Not ahead of me. Aligned. I backed out slowly. The signal weakened only when I did. At the trailhead it stopped. No sign of anyone. No further transmission. I logged it as anomalous radio interference and returned to base. That was the correct report. It just wasn't the complete one. I didn't mention the voice in my report. I documented signal strength, terrain interference, and time stamps. Everything that could be verified. Everything that could be dismissed later if it needed to be. That was my mistake. Because once it happens to one person, it's an anomaly. When it happens to several, it becomes a route. 2 nights later, a search and rescue call came in just before dusk. A solo hiker overdue from a loop trail that should have taken 4 hours at most. Weather had turned earlier than expected. Temperature dropping fast. Standard response. We split into teams. Grid search. Radio check-ins every 15 minutes. At 1940, one of the volunteers missed a check-in. At 1942, his call sign came over the radio anyway. Clear. Calm. Said he was fine. Said he was moving toward the trailhead. Dispatch logged it as resolved. Except the volunteer standing next to me hadn't keyed his mic. He was looking at his radio with the same expression I'd worn 2 nights earlier. We called his name. He answered in person. At the same time, his call sign repeated over the radio. Same words. Same cadence. Different source. We shut down the channel. Switched to backup. The voice followed. Not immediately. Not aggressively. Patiently. Like it was waiting for the system to settle before speaking again. We found the hiker an hour later. Alive. Hypothermic. Confused. He was sitting off trail. Less than 100 yards from the path. Staring at a stand of trees like he was waiting for someone to step out. He told us he'd followed the voice. Said it sounded like someone from the rescue team calling him by name. Giving directions. Telling him to leave the trail and take a shortcut. He hadn't questioned it. Why would he? When you're cold and tired and lost, you don't question guidance. You accept it. Back at base, we compared notes. This wasn't new. Over the last decade, there had been 6 missing persons cases in that section of forest where searchers reported hearing familiar voices. Sometimes dispatch, sometimes other hikers, sometimes their own call signs. In 3 cases, the missing were found. In 3, they weren't. The map was the last thing that made it impossible to ignore. A SAR coordinator laid out the GPS tracks from past searches. Overlaid them on a topographic map. They didn't overlap. They converged. Different years, different teams, different incidents. All pulled toward the same interior basin. An area with no marked trails and no reason for foot traffic. No bodies had ever been found there. Just equipment, radios, packs, boots placed neatly together like someone had stopped, sat down, and decided not to continue. We marked the basin as restricted. Closed the trails leading toward it. Updated the briefings. And added an unwritten rule. If you hear your call sign in the forest and you didn't key your mic, you do not answer. You stop. You ground yourself. You wait for visual confirmation. Because whatever uses the voices doesn't chase. It guides. The first time it used my real name, I understood why people walk off trail. Call signs are professional. They belong to the job. You're trained to challenge them. Your real name is different. Your real name assumes familiarity. It assumes permission. We were 3 days into the closure when it happened. Early morning. Cold enough that breath hung in the air longer than it should have. I was at the edge of the restricted zone with a SAR coordinator, double-checking signage before sunrise. The radio was quiet. That should have been reassuring. I stepped a few yards away to check a boundary marker that had been flagged on the map. Trees close together there, ground sloping inward. You couldn't see more than 30 yards in any direction. That's when I heard it. Not over the radio. Behind me. Frank. Just once. Not urgent. Not afraid. Neutral. The way someone says your name when they want your attention but don't want to alarm you. I didn't turn around. I checked my radio. No open channel. No transmission indicator. The coordinator was still where I'd left him. Looking at his clipboard. Not reacting. Frank, closer this time. From the trees, I did exactly what we'd added to the briefing. I stopped. I planted my feet. I looked at something solid and real and named it in my head. Truck, fence post, signage. The voice didn't repeat itself. Instead, I heard movement. Not footsteps. Pressure. Like something shifting weight without displacing ground. I backed out slowly until I was back in open sightline. The feeling released the same way it had at the trailhead nights earlier. Not abruptly. Just done. I didn't tell anyone what name it used. I didn't need to. 2 weeks later, a seasonal ranger resigned without notice. No incident report, no conflict, just a quiet exit. He told me privately that he'd heard his mother's voice in the forest. She'd been dead 12 years. She hadn't called for help. She'd told him he was close, that he could rest now. That was when the decision was made. Not formally, Operationally, the basin was removed from public maps. Trail data rerouted. Old signage taken down instead of replaced. We didn't fence it. Fences draw attention. We let it disappear the way places sometimes do, by no longer being named. Search and rescue protocols were updated. If a signal pulls toward that area, teams are ordered to stop and wait for daylight. No solo approaches. No voice confirmation without visual. No following directions that don't exist on paper. I transferred out at the end of that rotation, back to paved roads. Radios had stayed where they were supposed to. But even now, when I hear my name spoken from somewhere it shouldn't be, I don't answer right away. Because forests don't repeat voices. They repurpose them, and if you listen too closely, they'll show you a path that feels shorter than it is. One that leads inward, where people stop walking. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was afraid. Because something had been resolved without my consent, and my body hadn't caught up to it yet. By morning, 3 internal notices were waiting in my inbox. Routine things. Schedule adjustments. Equipment inventory reminders. A quiet reallocation of responsibilities that usually happened when someone was on their way out. Except I hadn't told anyone I was leaving yet. The radio stayed off. Battery removed. Stored in the glove compartment like a loaded weapon you don't trust yourself to carry. I finished my shifts clean. No anomalies. No open channels. No voices. That should have been the end. It wasn't. 2 weeks later, a deputy I'd trained pulled me aside after roll call. Young, solid, by the book. He asked me a procedural question that didn't make sense. What do you do, he asked, when a location responds before you arrive? I didn't answer right away. I asked where he'd heard that phrasing. He said it came over the radio during a welfare check. No dispatcher voice. Just a calm prompt asking him to confirm arrival before he'd turned onto the road. It used his unit ID. He laughed when he told me. Nervous, trying to make it sound like interference. I didn't laugh. I asked what he did next. He said he acknowledged and proceeded as normal. The location was empty when he arrived. Nothing wrong, nothing missing. But when he left, the radio thanked him. That's when I understood what the ledger wanted. Not confession. Not confrontation. Continuity. It didn't need someone to solve anything. It needed someone to remain available. Someone whose job it was to respond. I turned in my badge the next day. No ceremony, no speeches. Just paperwork and a handshake. The system adjusted quickly. It always does. I boxed up my personal effects and left the building without looking back. I didn't want to know what it would remember of me. I sold the radio scanner, gave away my old logs. Stopped listening to dispatch frequencies at night. That was the boundary I could control. Sometimes I still think about the places. Highway 60, quiet and straight under the moon. The interview room that knew more than the files ever did. The basin where voices became paths. They're all still there. Unresolved doesn't mean active. It just means waiting. I believe this now. The job isn't to fix what can't be fixed. It's to make sure the weight doesn't concentrate in one place for too long. That's why it moves. That's why it transfers. That's why there's always someone new answering the call. Not because they're chosen, because they're available. I don't answer anymore. Not radios, not echoes, not my name spoken from places that shouldn't know it. That's how I stay out of the ledger. But I know it's still being kept, somewhere, quietly.